Hi, I'm Danielle Gagne with Commercial UAV News, and today I'm speaking with Andrew Elefant, Director of Legal and Policy at Kittyhawk, to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on Part 107 testing. Hi, Andrew. How are you doing today?
Hi, Danielle. I'm doing pretty well. Thanks.
Good. To get started, can you tell us a little bit about what your role is at Kittyhawk?
Sure. So I'm Kittyhawk's Director of Legal and Policy. I handle all of our legal and policy matters in terms of what's going on in the regulatory world, what sort of legal risks our customers and user community might be facing. And part of my job is to help communicate that to our user community so that they have actionable advice and actionable information for them to use in their operations.
Excellent. So the current situation regarding test site closure seems pretty clear-cut at the moment for pilots in training and those wishing to renew their certificates. Aspiring pilots are unable to take their initial exam. Can you briefly explain how this is impacting the industry and discuss the ways that you think that the FAA may choose to address the issue?
Yeah, sure. And I think that's a good way of phrasing it. The current situation is pretty clear cut for those who have their Part 107 certificate. Right now, the large majority of test centers are currently closed. The biggest testing organization closed their testing centers in the middle of March, and at least currently, most of those are going to, at the earliest, be opened up in early May or at the end of April. So what that really means is that anyone who is trying to take a Part 107 exam, whether that's the initial exam or the recurrent exam, they're unable to do so, and that does have a major impact on the industry. Specifically because there's no online option to take the Part 107 exam unless you belong to a very, very small subset of Part 107 operators who are already current Part 61 general aviation or commercial pilots. And the problem with this is that Part 107 requires that in order to operate as a remote pilot in command, you have to take and pass a recurrent exam every 24 months. And they give you until the end of the 24th month to take and pass that exam. But if you're not current, you can't operate as a remote pilot in command. And as for how this is affecting the industry, really two main ways that it's affecting things. First, if you're operating a drone program and you're trying to hire more UAS operators to operate as a remote pilot in command, you're really not able to scale up your program right now. Because any UAS operators that you're bringing on, they can't take their initial Part 107 exam, and therefore they can't operate as a remote pilot in command. And the other problem is that if you have remote pilot in command operators that are not current because they need to take the recurrent exam, they can't operate as such. So the people that this mostly affects are unlucky UAS operators whose currency expired in March or will expire at the end of April, or anyone who decided that they weren't going to fly in the winter and didn't need to take their recurrent exam until the spring. Those folks are really unable to do so, and there's not a quick fix for it. I think the other part of your question is that, as I alluded to, there's really only a couple of main options for the FAA to let these folks fly, and one is that they could temporarily exempt UAS operators whose currency expired in March or April, and that would mirror some of what we're seeing in other parts of the aviation community, where things like medical certificates for certain classes of pilots, they're being granted an exemption, I think from March 30th until June 30th, so that they don't have to go and take their medical exam in person. So they could offer an exemption, or they could offer the online test available to current Part 61 pilots as a way of fulfilling the Part 107 currency requirement. The problem with that the reason that they might do that is building a new online test is going to take a really long time, and in the long run probably will be unnecessary. But the problem is that this isn't an adequate replacement for the initial exam. There's nothing online that can replicate that. So those folks are also they also may have some problems getting people that want to take their Part 107 initial exam into the system.
Now, since your article, testing centers have extended their closure date to April 30th. Obviously, this is going to impact a larger segment of licensed drone operators who need to renew their certificates. Do you think this will affect how and or when the FAA will ultimately decide to handle this situation?
Yeah, it does. So as you said, a lot of the testing centers have extended their closure date until at least April 30th. And this is going to impact a larger segment of licensed drone operators. How this will affect how the FAA will ultimately decide to handle this situation. I think one thing to keep in mind is that, as I said earlier, your currency expires at the end of the 24th month after you take your initial exam. So in some ways, those folks who weren't able to do so in March, they're currently out of luck. And so my expectation is that especially if there's a requirement to take the online exam available to Part 61 pilots, if those people need to do so, I would imagine the FAA would sooner rather than later, probably in the next week or so, announce their intention to have people do that, just so that they're able to spend a couple of weeks taking that exam, and they have an opportunity to do so. However, as I said, if their currency expires at the end of April, so anyone whose certificate expires in April, they will still be able to operate until the end of the month. And that might ultimately mean that it could be a couple of weeks because they have that time to, it won't affect anyone beyond those who weren't able to take it in March until the end of April.
Gotcha. As these dates get extended into the future, do you think we will start to see less compliance as more and more people are affected and essential tasks need to get done to keep businesses running?
So if the dates do get extended into the future, I think that really is the danger in waiting too long, because as with a lot of things, if it becomes much less realistic to comply, you'll probably see fewer people even attempting to comply. But I think that an important thing to keep in mind is that there are, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but there are ways that you can help integrate current and also non-current remote pilots into your operation. But I think the more important point here is that there are essential tasks that need to get done to keep businesses up and running, whether that's drone programs that operate in critical infrastructure or other essential industries. I think one danger is that highly qualified and folks who are really talented and operate in critical areas and have certain skills, they might not be able to be utilized. And so in some ways there may be a desire to operate non-compliantly if you feel like you have no other choice. I'm definitely not suggesting that people operate outside of 107. It's there for a reason, but is definitely something that I think drone operations are considering, is if this is a longer fix, how they're going to continue to keep their businesses up and running.
So you bring up a good point there. So there might be a decision to make, but there's also a lot of risk involved for businesses who may choose to not to fly with non-current RPICs in order to keep their operations going. What are some of the risks that businesses should consider before taking this kind of gamble? For example, if something went wrong, could businesses expect any coverage from their insurance? Would there be additional liabilities or even potential legal ramifications?
Yeah, so this is another important point. Even beyond, from the FAA side of things, there has been, enforcement actions have been loosened for others in the aviation industry. The FAA has said that they're not going to enforce certain regulations for others in the aviation industry. So I don't know that there is the FAA risk and the regulatory risk of not complying with Part 107, but as you mentioned, there are certainly bigger business risks that are definitely a reason why a drone program would need to think through the ramifications of operating non-compliantly. One that you mentioned, which is absolutely true, is insurance is absolutely necessary for a lot of drone programs, and everyone should take a look at their policy, and every policy is a little bit different. But I think that's one of the main dangers of operating non-compliantly is you should expect that you may not have insurance coverage if you're operating outside of Part 107. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind in all of this. Not only the insurance ramifications, but even other liabilities if someone were to get injured or damage were to be caused. If you're operating non-compliantly, even in the best case, it's not a good look and could cause other problems. But if you're operating non-compliantly, there could be other legal ramifications from not only people that may be injured or damage that might be caused, but could also cause issues with a business license or other more state and local issues. And one thing that is true is that if damage is caused, one of the things that they're going to look at is whether you're operating compliantly. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Is it's not just the FAA regulations that might be triggered by operating non-compliantly. There are definitely bigger issues here as well.
Excellent point. Okay, so even within FAA regulations, though, you've discussed that there are approved ways to keep experienced non-current pilots helping with projects. What are some of the ways that businesses can stay within regulations while still being able to utilize their grounded RPICs?
Yeah, that's a great question, and is really one that I wanted to address here. In spite of the doom and gloom in terms of operating, those who aren't able to operate as a remote pilot in command, really one of the most important takeaways and things to know about the current situation is that non-current Part 107 certificate holders are able to perform a lot of useful tasks, and they can continue to participate in a lot of aspects of UAS operations. So just to break this down a little bit, non-current Part 107 certificate holders cannot be the remote pilot in command of a drone operation. But there are a couple of important ways that they can still be valuable members of a drone program. The most important is that if you're a non-current Part 107 certificate holder, you can still operate the UAS and be the main person manipulating the controls of that UAS. So Part 107 specifically allows for this, that people that are not Part 107 current can be manipulating the controls in the operation. They could also operate as a VO, but I'll get to that in a second. The catch here is that a current remote pilot in command has to be supervising the operation. So you can have someone non-current on the sticks, but a remote pilot in command must supervise the operation. And what that means is that the remote pilot in command has to have the ability to immediately take direct control of the flight of the UAS. So they can't be, a mile away. They can't be in the building next door. They can't be too far away. They need to immediately be able to take control of the UAS. And the other catch, because I know what some of you are thinking, the remote piloting command can only supervise one UAS operator at a time. So you can't just take your one current Part 107 remote piloting command and have him or her just stand there and have multiple non-current remote pilots operating UAS around them. And the other important point to make is, as always, anyone with a Part 107 certificate, whether they're current or not, is going to make a really valuable visual observer in any operation that would be made safer by the presence of a VO, or needs the requirement of a VO. So those are some of the ways that that a non-current Part 107 certificate holder can still be valuable. And the other part of this is that's a good point to make, is that this is one way where if you have a remote pilot with a particular set of skills or is particularly talented doing certain types of operations, they'll still be able to contribute a large part, and they will be able to contribute their skills. They just need to do so in the immediate vicinity of a current remote piloting command.
That's good to hear. So in light of all of this, do you foresee any long-term effects of halting certification testing of emerging would-be pilots into the workforce?
So that's a really good point. As I mentioned earlier, there are a couple of easier fixes for folks that need to take the recurrent exam, but none of these really address the issue of getting aspiring, emerging, would-be remote pilots into the workforce. There really is no seemingly obvious replacement for the initial exam. And that, hopefully, if this situation doesn't last too long, it won't have a significant effect. But I could definitely foresee a situation where if the current situation lags for a long time, you're just going to have fewer people that are current remote pilots. And you're also going to have people that want to earn their Part 107 certificate that just aren't going to be able to. So while I think it's really important and is kind of the lower hanging fruit to address issues with getting current remote pilots back up in the air and getting them an opportunity to either be exempt from or able to take an online version of the recurrent exam, the bigger issue with longer term effects is that there's essentially a freeze on people who are trying to earn their Part 107 certificate for the first time. And that could cause some long-term effects just in terms of fewer pilots out there, and also an inability for drone programs to add more pilots. So those could be some of the longer-term effects of halting the certification and offering the initial exam for those who want to take it. So that's also something that I would love to see addressed sooner rather than later, and in a lot of ways is the more complicated issue to address.
Yeah, it does sound very complicated. Do you think virtual training could play a role in any of this? I know there are a couple companies out there that are showing promise in being able to do virtual remote piloting. Is there any indication that the FAA might adopt something like that?
Well, I mean, there's certainly a lot of there are certainly a lot of options for like test prep. So there are a lot of companies that do offer ability to learn what you need to know to take the Part 107 exam. And those resources are still out there and are certainly valuable for anyone who wants to kind of get all the way there in terms of their knowledge base and their ability to be ready to take an exam. But I think still the big bottleneck issue here is that even if you're ready to take the exam, you need to be able to take that, and currently that's only in a testing center. So I think that there are a lot of resources where people can acquire knowledge and learn some skills and things like that. But if the testing part of this is unaddressed, there's really not too much that you can do other than just hone your skills and acquire knowledge.
Excellent, thank you. And for pilots who have been affected by the test site closures, what are some resources that they can consult to stay on top of the latest news and developments regarding the FAA's plans to address this issue?
Sure. So, I mean, as with a lot of things in the world right now, the news is changing quickly. Things are changing quickly, and it is really important to stay on top of this information. So, at Kittyhawk, we're staying on top of any news that affects our user community, and we're doing part of the job of monitoring for any changes that are going to affect our user community. For example, I wrote a blog post for our user community laying out a lot of the topics that we covered today, and Kittyhawk continues to provide current information on our social media channels. And I'll also be writing about some of the other effects of the current situation in terms of how it will affect your drone program or your drone operations. And as always, follow the FAA on social media. They have a good social media presence as well that they keep updated pretty constantly. There's also a new webpage at faa.gov/coronavirus that contains information on the current situation and its effect on FAA operations and FAA decisions. So to sum up, Kittyhawk is following this really closely. Follow us on social media, and also stay tuned on the FAA's social media and on that webpage, because things are moving pretty quick. The news could be updated pretty quickly as well. So those are some of the best ways to stay up to date on this topic as things move forward.
All right, those are all the questions I have today. Thank you so much for talking with me and kind of laying this out for our readers and viewers. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me on. I'm always happy to talk about any sort of regulatory and compliance issues facing the drone community, and so I appreciate you having me on to discuss some of these.